Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. The U.S. government has charged 3 North Korean hackers for conspiring to steal more than $1.3 billion in cash and cryptocurrency around the world. After unsealing the indictment, the FBI and other U.S. agencies issued an alert on North Korean cyber attacks for the first time since the Biden administration took charge. The international sanctions have greatly affected how North Korea conducts its economic activities as the regime continues to try finding ways to evade sanctions amid its economic pain. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is William Brown, professor at the Georgetown University. Professor Brown spent 3 decades in the U.S. government, including the CIA and the Commerce Department, focusing on the North Korean and Chinese economies. Also joining me is Joshua Stanton, a lawyer in Washington, D.C. Mr. Stanton has helped the U.S. Congress draft numerous North Korean sanctions bills and laws. His blog, freekorea.us, focuses on North Korea sanctions and other related issues. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
First of all, Professor William, what do you think was behind the latest indictment of 3 North Korean hackers by the U.S. Department of Justice?
My thinking is this probably has nothing to do with the administration. It's probably set in train quite a long time ago. But anyway, I'm glad it happened. And it's a little bit different. I'm sure Joshua's a lawyer. He'll get more into it. But this is a little different because it's focused on a crime, a crime that everybody in the world would recognize, bank robbery. It's much different than trying to evade sanctions. So I quite welcome this, and I especially welcome the designation of the 3, actually 2 new individuals, and 1 person who's designated several years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stanton, as Professor Brown said, the Justice Department seems to be working on this issue for a while, and the indictment was made in December last year. Why did it take 2 months to unseal this indictment? Is it a usual thing?
Yes, it is a usual thing. You have to understand how grand juries work just a little bit to understand that. Under Rule 6E, grand jury proceedings and documents are absolutely secret, and you cannot release any of that information, including indictments, unless the court orders it. We know that one of the defendants in this case was indicted at least a couple of years ago. I don't know any information about what the grand jury has been considering, and I wouldn't say so if I did, but nonetheless, we know from prior action that this is a developing case. For one of the defendants, this is basically a superseding indictment. And from the DOJ press releases, we also know that there are additional defendants, including one Canadian who has entered a plea and is cooperating. So this is just the next shoe to drop in what is likely to be an ongoing proceeding. It doesn't really tell us anything about the administration's political direction because so much of it happened in the last administration, and frankly, because criminal prosecutions for crimes like theft and conspiracy ought to be independent of political influence.
North Korea's cyber attacks are now frequently reported in the media. From what we have seen so far, these activities are divided into 2. So first of all, for espionage, and the other for financial gains. And earlier in 2019, a UN report estimated North Korea amassed $2 billion through cyber attacks. Are the cyber activities actually helping keep the North Korean regime afloat?
Compared to a national budget or a GDP of a country, they're small numbers. But North Korea by now is under such strain, financial strain. I mean, their government, I think, is under such strain. Every dollar counts. So one thing I like about this Justice Department indictment, or the messaging around it, is that they're pretty careful not to exaggerate the numbers. We see a lot of sort of exaggerated numbers, but these they're careful. They say 1.3 billion, that's a lot of money. That's targeted. They don't say the North Koreans got that much, but they do imply that they got a lot. So yeah, hundreds of millions of dollars is really important for this regime right now. And it's not that they just got it yesterday. They've been getting it over the years. So it's important to them. Obviously, they're risking their entire reputation of their country, so it's very important to them. And they're wrecking their reputation for what I think is very paltry gains.
Professor Brown, is the increase in North Korea's malicious cyber activities attributable to the international sanctions?
Clearly, the international sanctions affect them. And as Joshua was saying, a lot of the same people are running the same kind of activities. But I would caution people to remember, I mean, ever since I've been watching on North Korea, they've been doing these kind of crazy illegal things. Illegal in the sense that everybody recognizes. You know, for years they were counterfeiting dollars, for example. They've been doing drugs. They've been doing all kinds of things well before these UN sanctions. So I have little doubt that without the sanctions, they would still be doing this and take advantage of what they can. But the sanctions do add to the whole environment, and they, in some ways, they make it harder. You know, North Korean assets now are all carefully hidden someplace. And because of the sanctions, they've gotten pretty good at hiding things and going around. So in that way, this international sanctions may be adding to the problem. But generally, I think North Korea would be doing this anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'd like to add to Professor Brown's point. And just make the point that under the 1994 agreed framework, President Clinton agreed to loosen sanctions and did so. The most important of those was a regulation that gave North Korea access to the financial system, specifically allowed for dollar clearing and allowed some North Korean mineral imports. We gave North Korea an open invitation to go legit, and they continue to carry on with cigarette smuggling and counterfeiting and drug dealing and all kinds of illegal activity. The cause of North Korea's illegal activity is not the fact that there are sanctions on North Korea. The fact that there are sanctions on North Korea is a function of the fact that it engages in illegal activity. And if you really look at what most of the sanctions on North Korea are, they're not really even fairly described as sanctions. They're just law enforcement actions that we would apply to any criminal organization anywhere else in the world.
Is the indictment enough to keep North Korea in check? I mean, indictment is one thing, and getting hold of those indicted is another, right?
That's right. I think you ask an excellent question, because bear in mind that these three defendants are all North Koreans. We're not going to arrest any of them. There is a criminal forfeiture count attached at the end of the indictment. And in theory, that would be great because it would mean that we could seize their money. But none of this is going to mean anything with respect to the people or the money if we can't arrest and arraign someone. So I would hope to see a related civil forfeiture case issued somewhere or filed somewhere in the Central District of California in the near future. That has a broader jurisdictional reach. Again, we see that there are other defendants cooperating. We will not see a difference until we begin to go after the banks and cryptocurrency exchanges that are looking beyond the obvious signs of money laundering in contrary to their legal obligations to stop money laundering. The banks have to be held accountable. Until we do that, we will fail.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brown, what's your thought on this? Should sanctions on North Korea's cyber attacks be expressly stipulated in the text like we do about their nuclear activities?
So this, to me, is a very international, global issue. It's not just our issue. Same, the nuclear weapons are not just our issue. So I'm thinking that, you know, and the UN accepted that. The UN General Security Council unanimously voted these sanctions. So it's just not the US, it's everybody. And I hope we can just keep pushing on everybody else to keep working on these. It's not just us. Yeah, and it's not just North Korea, it's the other issues. There's a lot of cyber theft going on. It's a really interesting area in monetary development. it's an attack on central banks in a lot of ways.
Then now let us turn to the overall existing sanctions against North Korea. How would you assess the efficacy of the sanctions, Professor Brown? Some say they were effective, but others say the otherwise.
Well, obviously they haven't stopped the nuclear program, and that's their aim. So in that sense, they've not been effective. But I don't think anybody in their right mind expected financial sanctions by themselves to stop the nuclear program. Other pressures, we had Trump's maximum pressure that I think worked for a while, but I think the pressure is still there. There's a huge amount of economic pressure on North Korea, and we're seeing the results internally. Again, it's sad because it's hurting North Korean people. Maybe more, and we don't really know, maybe more than it's hurting their military or their nuclear program. But I wouldn't say they've been ineffective. They're clearly, Kim Jong-un, even last week, is criticizing his own government, his own planners, his own economists. What's going wrong with our own economy? Well, everybody knows what's wrong with their economy, except him. He needs to make some reforms. And I think ultimately all these pressures will push him in that direction.
Mr. Stanton, I would like to hear your thoughts as well.
So I guess I have a somewhat less optimistic view or positive view than Professor Brown does. Look, I think that what we had was effectively under President Trump 1 year of medium pressure. We've never really had maximum pressure. As I have said from the very beginning, it'll be maximum pressure when the Chinese and Russian banks that are laundering Kim Jong-un's money start to stare at 9-digit civil penalties. I'm carefully watching a particular case in the District of Columbia Federal Court to see when that will be unsealed, because that might be the case where we will begin to see those penalties, but we haven't seen them yet. So the sanctions have been poorly enforced.
The Biden administration made it clear that it is considering both sanctions and incentives as part of efforts to denuclearize North Korea. Mr. Stanton, what kind of actions does the Biden team need to take about sanctions?
Well, as I said, I think it's just absolutely essential that we start holding the banks in China in particular accountable for their behavior. There have been requirements to perform enhanced due diligence to avoid North Korean money laundering now for about 3 or 4 years. There are requirements to expel North Korean financial representatives. Look, there is a very long-standing pattern of China very willfully, very deliberately violating sanctions. You see Chinese-made missile carriers parading down the streets of Pyongyang in the most famous example, but none of this money laundering and theft would be possible if China wasn't deliberately, and I look, read the UN panel of experts reports, read the indictments, deliberately facilitating North Korea's conduct, and that includes crimes against humanity and nuclear proliferation, the export of proliferation-sensitive equipment to Syria, including for its chemical program. Chinese banks must be held accountable. When we do that, we will see effects like we saw when the Obama administration held European banks accountable for helping Iran. Why are we harsher on our friends than we are on our enemies? Congress wants this to happen. It is in a very bipartisan way telling the Treasury Department that the Chinese banking industry has to be held accountable. If we do it, we might succeed. If we don't do it, we will fail.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brown, Mr. Stanton just pointed out that China is not fully enforcing sanctions on North Korea. And the previous Trump administration criticized China that it is overtly helping North Korea's sanctions-busting activities. Will the Biden team maintain the similar stance on responding to China regarding North Korean sanctions?
When you bring China into the picture, it's an amazingly complicated story. China is an enormous country right next door to Pyongyang, to North Korea, and they have millions of Koreans living in China, many Chinese living in North Korea. It's a little bit like Mexico and the US. It's very hard to disentangle completely. Now, I quite agree with Joshua that sanctions need to be enforced, especially these are Chinese sanctions. I mean, they agreed to them in the UN Security Council. And at a top level, they have the same, I'm convinced they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. We don't want them, you know. We're basically on the same page on a lot of these issues. On other issues, we're not on the same page, and we have huge disagreements with China. But for us, to me, what's going to work in North Korea is to keep, for U.S. and China to work together to squeeze this program. And, you know, I think it's the Chinese, they block trade, basically. There's a lot of, you know, smuggling going on, but essentially they've knocked out at least 2/3 of their trade with North Korea. So it's unfair to say China is not going along with the sanctions. It is fair to criticize they're not going enough. The main way the Chinese are helping North Korea, in my mind, is delivery of crude oil. They give North Korea 500,000 tons of crude oil every year. They've been doing this since Mao Zedong. That's North Korea's primary source of petroleum, something they absolutely have to have. And I'm thinking the Chinese are using that as the last lever on North Korea. If North Korea should do something really bad, like an atmospheric test, Chinese have that big lever. They can cut off petroleum. So there's still some things to go, and we're certainly not there yet. But I think a big part of the administration needs to be to work with China to enforce these sanctions and to get what we need, what we both need out of North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brown, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has admitted that his economic policies have largely failed. He even fired a senior economic official a few days ago, as you said earlier, for producing unworkable plans. Professor Brown, what is workable at this stage?
I think it's pretty fascinating in that most of his complaints in the last few months, Kim's complaints, are domestic. He's not really blaming the virus so much. That's what I would do. That's what our government would do. He's not really even blaming the sanctions so much. He's blaming his own management of his own economy. It's a domestic kind of issue. It's possible that he's getting concerned, that Kim is getting concerned, that people in North Korea are getting worried that this nuclear program is damaging their own economy. And in that sense, he can't talk about it. But there are ways he can reform his own economy independent of the nuclear business. He's doing it a little bit, but I must say this last Congress, People's Congress, was very disappointing in the absence of reforms. They need to reform. If they can, I like to say North Korea has a lot of assets. They just use them very poorly. That's why they're the poorest, such a poor place. But if they can reform, they can get better use of their assets, human capital, physical capital, geography, a lot of good things they have. They just make terrible use of them because of their socialist system. If they can back off on some of that socialism, they can get some pretty remarkable gains. And I would hope that's the way they would work in the future.
Will North Korea's economy difficulties eventually lead to possibility of being engaged in talks with the U.S., Mr. Stanton?
Sure. We have historically seen that when North Korea comes under greater economic pressure, as it did in early 2018, or as it did in 2005 to 2007, it does come back and talk. The problem is that they come back and talk to get sanctions relief. We release the sanctions or loosen the sanctions, and then North Korea suddenly has no more incentive to negotiate in good faith. So there's a difference between talks and actually having those talks lead to something productive. If you want the talks to lead to something productive, you have to find a way to deliver some incentives in a way that does not release the pressure. I think the direction that we need to turn is toward putting the forfeited and confiscated assets that we take from the proceeds of North Korean crime, put those in escrow, and say that those funds will be available for food and medicine and humanitarian purposes, even as we redouble our enforcement of the sanctions. That way there is a formula for relief and for incentives without relaxing our laws and without taking off the pressure we need to have a durable peace.
Professor Brown, if North Korea is willing to talk, what kind of gestures should the U.S. take now?
Well, you know, I like to think of sanctions working best as kind of like scissors, you know, where you have competing blades and where you put a sanction on something you don't like, but you reward something that you do like. So I would guess that there's some things that we like, most we don't like, but I'm guessing there's some things we like about North Korea, and we should try to reward those activities. Generally, though, probably the Biden administration we're looking at all of these things. I'm sure they are. I know some of the people, but the trick is not to give in to North Korea, not to give in to the regime. I mean, this is what we've done so many times. No gift giving, basically. No gifts, just we've done way too much of this. North Korea, in a way, is in better shape now that it's not getting all these gifts. And it's forcing them to make, I think, some internal changes. And that we need to keep that kind of pressure on them.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. State Department said the ongoing review of U.S. policy towards North Korea will take into account cyber threats posed by the regime. North Korea has refrained from military provocations for some time now, but its cyber activities are now widely seen as a new growing threat to the international security. Professor Brown, Mr. Stanton, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.